Over the next few lessons, we're going to explore various input fields or input controls in HTML. In this lesson, we're going to talk about text fields. So, to simplify things, I've cleaned up the code in the previous lesson. Now we only have a form element with nothing else. So, let's add an input field with the type of text. Here's what we get. Now, as you can see, this input field is taking up the entire width of the page. That is the style that comes from milligram. So I'm going to apply a style to our form element and give it a width of 50% and some padding so we can clearly see this input field. So back to our style sheet, let's define a rule and set the width to 50% and padding to 2 rems. Okay, that's better. So here's a text field. If we change the type to number, now we get these buttons for changing the value. This also has a couple more benefits. If the user is on a mobile phone or a tablet, the soft keyboard that automatically pops up changes to numbers, so they can only see numbers. It makes it easier to use this form. The other benefit is that now we can only enter numbers. So if I try to type A, B, C, D, look, nothing is coming up because this is a number field. So for capturing numeric values, always set the type to number. We also have password. Now, whatever we type here is masked. We can also change the type to date. Now we get this beautiful icon, and of course, this is coming from milligram. When we tap on it, we get a calendar. So we can easily go to various months, various years. This is implemented in the browser by default. We didn't have to write any code for it. We also have email that you saw in the previous lesson. With this type, the user has to type a valid email address. So if we type some random text here and then try to submit the form, the browser will stop us. It will give us a validation error. We'll talk about that later in this section. So these are various types for the input element. Now there are more types, but they're not used that often. But in case you're curious, just search for HTML input element. Now, look at this page, developer.mozilla.org. Here you can find the documentation for the input element. So take a look. So here are various input types. We have button, checkbox, color, and so on. We'll cover some more input types as we go through this section. Now, what if you want to type multiple lines of text here? We'll have to use a text area element. So here we type text area. Now VS Code automatically adds these attributes. Name and ID, don't worry about them. We'll talk about them later. Cols represents the number of columns or characters in the line, which is set to 30. And rows represents the number of lines. So if we save the changes, here's what we get. We can type multiple lines of text, and we can also resize this text area like this. Now using CSS, we can always stop resizing. So here we can define a rule for our text area and set resize to none. Now look, this text area is no longer resizable. And by the way, if you're curious, this is Grammarly. It's just a plugin I've installed in Chrome. Now when using milligram, if we change the number of columns or rows, we're not going to see any differences. So if I set the rows to, let's say 2, we still see a text area with the same size. This is because of the height that milligram applies to this input field. We can always change that if we want to. Now for the rest of this demo, I'm going to delete these 2 attributes. We don't really need them. Now these input fields have a few attributes you need to be familiar with. The first one is value. We can use this to pre-populate an input field. For example, I can type my email here. Now, the input field is pre-populated. Another useful attribute is placeholder. So if we set placeholder to email, look, when the input field is empty, we see this label. But once we start typing, that label disappears. Another useful attribute is read only. With this, the user cannot change the value of this input field. So in this case, we probably want to set the value to something. They can see it, but they cannot change it. Another similar attribute is disabled. With disabled, we cannot even select this input field. And when submitting the form, this value will not be sent to the server. So that's the difference between read only and disable. Another attribute you need to know is max length. This is used for validation. So if we set this to 5, the user can only type 5 characters, no more. Another good attribute to know is autofocus. This is a Boolean attribute, so we don't have to give it a value. Now, when the page loads, the first input field automatically gets focused. This is particularly useful for login or registration forms because we don't want the user to explicitly click on the first input field to activate it. Now, text area also has the same attributes we talked about, so we can disable them, we can make them read-only, we can give them a placeholder. But if you want to pre-populate them, see, we don't have the value attribute here. Instead, we have to type our value in between the tags. So here we can write some comment, and it's populated here. So this is all about text fields. Now, sometimes as we type something here, we want to see a list of suggestions. I will show you how to implement that next.